The chandelier crystals caught the light like 1,000 frozen stars, casting prismatic shadows across the ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel. It was the kind of place where champagne flowed as freely as conversation, where laughter echoed off marble walls, and where the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma of catered delicacies that cost more than most people earned in a month. This was New York's elite at play, a gathering of those who shaped markets, influenced politics, and lived in a world most could only glimpse through magazine spreads and news headlines. At the center table, commanding attention without effort, sat Victoria Hale. At 43, she possessed the kind of beauty that wealth could enhance but not create. Sharp cheekbones, ice blue eyes that missed nothing, and an air of absolute certainty that came from never having been told no. Her fortune, built on a tech empire and strategic real estate investments, had made her one of the most powerful women in America. Forbes had called her ruthless. Business Insider had called her brilliant. Those who knew her personally might have used different words entirely. She wore a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than a car. Her platinum hair swept back to reveal diamond earrings that caught the light with every slight turn of her head. Around her sat a carefully curated collection of socialites, entrepreneurs, and artists, all laughing at her jokes, all competing for her attention, all aware that Victoria Hale's favor could open doors that no amount of talent or hard work ever would. Moving between the tables, with practiced efficiency, was Marcus Green. At 26, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that his black server's uniform couldn't diminish. His hands were steady as he balanced trays of champagne flutes. His movements fluid and unobtrusive, the kind of invisible presence that wealthy patrons preferred from their service staff. But there was something in his eyes, a depth that suggested layers beneath the surface, stories untold, dreams deferred but not destroyed. Marcus had learned early how to make himself small in spaces like this. Growing up in the Bronx with a single mother who worked 3 jobs, he understood the unspoken rules of wealth. Don't make eye contact unless spoken to, don't offer opinions, and above all, remember that you're here to serve, not to be seen. Yet even as he moved through the glittering crowd, refilling glasses and clearing plates, part of him couldn't help but notice the acoustics of the room, the way sound traveled up to the vaulted ceiling and back down, creating a natural reverb that any singer would appreciate. Once, Marcus had dreamed of standing in rooms like this for different reasons. He remembered being 16, staying up late with headphones on, learning every run and riff from the singers he admired, filling notebooks with lyrics that tried to capture what it felt like to want something so desperately it hurt. He remembered the audition for Juilliard, how his hands had shaken as he'd held the sheet music, how his voice had cracked on the first note before finding its strength. He remembered the letter that came 3 weeks later, the one that praised his raw talent but regretted to inform him that without adequate financial resources, they couldn't extend an offer of admission. The scholarship he'd hoped for had gone to someone else. The dreams had to be packed away, filed under things that people like him didn't get to have. His mother had cried when he told her, not because she was disappointed in him, but because she knew what it meant. Another door closed. Another reminder that talent alone wasn't enough in a world that ran on connections and capital. So Marcus had learned to survive, instead of dream. He'd taken the job at the Whitmore Grand Hotel because it paid better than most, because the tips from wealthy guests could actually make a difference, because it was honest work even if it wasn't the work he'd imagined for himself. He'd learned to smile politely at condescending remarks, to accept the occasional racist comment with a nod and a turn back, to be grateful for what he had rather than bitter about what he'd lost. Tonight felt like any other night at first. The usual parade of privilege, the usual casual displays of wealth that would have fed a family for a year. Marcus moved through it all with practiced professionalism, his mind half occupied with calculations about rent, about his mother's medical bills, about whether he could pick up an extra shift next week. That was when Victoria's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife through silk. "You there?" The tall one. Marcus turned, already knowing he was being addressed. Victoria was looking directly at him, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Around her, conversation had paused. Her companions watched with the anticipation of people expecting entertainment. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus kept his voice neutral, professional. Victoria leaned back in her chair, regarding him with the kind of casual interest someone might show a curiosity in a shop window. "My friends and I were just discussing talent. Real talent, not the manufactured kind. And I realized something." She gestured around the room. "All these people, all this wealth, all this supposed sophistication, and what are we really? Just consumers. Audiences. We don't create anything ourselves." A few of her companions laughed, though Marcus couldn't tell if they were agreeing or just following her lead. Victoria continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "So, I have a proposal. A test, if you will. I want you to sing something for us. Right here, right now. Let's see if there's any genuine artistry left in the world, or if it's all been commercialized into nothing. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around the table, heads turned. At nearby tables, people were starting to notice the exchange. He felt his fingers tighten around the tray he was holding, the champagne glasses trembling slightly. I'm not sure that's appropriate, ma'am, he managed, keeping his voice level despite the anger rising in his chest. I'm working right now. Victoria's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, come now. Don't be modest. I'm sure a strapping young man like yourself has some hidden talent. Besides, consider it part of the service. She glanced at her companions. We could all use some authentic entertainment, couldn't we? Something real, not packaged and produced? The laughter that followed was like needles against Marcus's skin. He understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about music or talent or authenticity. This was about power. This was about a woman who had so much of everything that she'd grown bored with mere possessions and had moved on to possessing people's dignity instead. He could refuse. He should refuse. But he also knew what refusing would mean. A complaint to management. A word from Victoria Hale, who probably knew the hotel owner personally, who could end his employment with a single phone call. And then what? Another job lost. Another setback in a life that had already seen too many. Marcus set down his tray carefully on a nearby service station. He could feel eyes on him from every direction now. The moment had expanded beyond Victoria's table, becoming a spectacle for the entire section of the ballroom. Some faces showed curiosity, others embarrassment, a few outright cruelty. But all of them were watching. In that moment, something shifted inside Marcus. He thought about his mother, who had never let anyone make her feel small even when the world tried. He thought about the dreams he'd buried but never quite killed. He thought about the person he'd been at 16, standing in that audition room, terrified but brave enough to try. Victoria wanted a performance? Fine. She'd get one. But not the humiliating display she'd expected. Not the nervous stumbling of someone forced to entertain their betters. Marcus straightened his spine. He took a breath, feeling his diaphragm expand, remembering years of technique he'd practiced in secret, in stolen moments, in the shower and empty subway cars. He thought of Aretha Franklin and Sam Cooke, of Nina Simone and Otis Redding, of all the voices that had refused to be silenced by a world that didn't want to hear them. Then he began to sing. The first note emerged pure and strong, filling the space with a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. He chose Summertime, the Gershwin standard that had been covered by countless artists, but never quite tamed. His voice carried the weight of every struggle, every disappointment, every morning he'd woken up knowing his dreams were on hold. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversation died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. People who had been laughing moments before found their smiles frozen, then fading. The sound was too powerful, too genuine, too full of soul to be dismissed or mocked. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the music take him. He forgot about the uniform, the tray, the humiliation of being commanded to perform like a trained animal. In this moment, he was exactly what he'd always been meant to be: a singer, an artist, a voice that demanded to be heard. His phrasing was impeccable, his control absolute. He bent notes like they were physical things, reshaping them to carry meaning beyond words. When he hit the high notes, they soared with a clarity that made the chandelier crystals seem to vibrate in sympathy. When he descended into the lower register, the sound was warm and intimate, as if he were singing directly to each person's hidden heart. Victoria's smile had vanished. She sat frozen, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, her expression shifting from amusement to confusion to something that might have been shock. Around her, her companions had gone equally still. One woman's eyes glistened with sudden tears. A man in an expensive suit had leaned forward, mouth slightly open, as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. Across the ballroom, other guests had turned toward the sound. Conversations at distant tables fell silent as Marcus's voice reached them, drawing them in like a siren's call. A few people stood to see better, craning their necks to identify the source of this extraordinary sound. Marcus opened his eyes as he moved into the final verse. He looked directly at Victoria, his gaze steady and unflinching. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted. She had commanded him to sing, expecting to diminish him. Instead, he had revealed a gift so profound that it exposed her own emptiness by contrast. All her wealth, all her power, couldn't buy what he possessed naturally. The ability to move human hearts, to speak truth through melody, to transform pain into beauty. The final note hung in the air for what seemed like forever, gradually fading into a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. No one moved. No one spoke. The moment stretched out, fragile and perfect, holding the entire room suspended in its grip. Then, from the back of the ballroom, a single person began to clap. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the room erupted into applause. Not the polite, perfunctory applause of social obligation, but genuine, thunderous appreciation. People were standing, some openly weeping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Marcus stood perfectly still, his professional mask slipping back into place, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He picked up his tray, ready to return to his duties as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just split the night open and revealed something raw and real. But Victoria wasn't finished with him yet. She recovered her composure with visible effort, her face hardening back into its usual expression of cool control. "Well," she said, her voice cutting through the applause. "That was certainly unexpected. Quite the hidden talent for someone who serves drinks for a living." The words were meant to diminish what had just happened, to reassert the proper order of things. But they fell flat. Around her table, her companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a silver-haired woman Marcus recognized as a prominent art gallery owner, actually frowned. "Victoria," the woman said quietly, "that was extraordinary. You've just discovered something remarkable." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's not get carried away, Diane. I'm sure there are many talented servers in this city. It doesn't change what he is." But the damage to her authority was done. Another voice spoke up, this one belonging to a distinguished African-American man in his 50s whom Marcus vaguely recognized from television. "What he is, Victoria, is a genuine artist. Something this room sees precious little of, despite all its pretensions." The man stood and walked toward Marcus, extending his hand. "Julian Crawford. I produce for Apex Records. I'd very much like to speak with you when you have a moment." Marcus stared at the offered hand as if it might disappear if he blinked. Julian Crawford. Even someone who'd been out of the music world for years knew that name. He'd worked with everyone from established legends to rising stars, had an ear for talent that had launched a dozen major careers. Marcus found his voice failing him in a way it hadn't during the song. "I'm working right now, sir." Julian smiled. "I can see that. But surely you get a break at some point." He pulled out a business card, pressing it into Marcus's palm. "I'm staying at this hotel through the weekend. Call me. Or better yet, come find me. I'm usually in the lobby lounge around 10 in the morning." Marcus looked down at the card, his vision blurring slightly. The embossed letters seemed to shimmer in the chandelier light. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. There had to be a catch, a cruelty embedded in the kindness. "Thank you, sir," he managed, his voice rough with emotion he was trying desperately to control. "I'll do that." As Julian returned to his seat, Marcus became aware of other eyes on him. Curious eyes, assessing eyes, eyes that were recalculating his worth based on new information. He felt exposed in a way that was different from the humiliation Victoria had intended. This exposure was somehow more dangerous because it involved hope, and hope had always been the most painful thing to lose. Victoria watched the exchange with an expression that could have frozen water. When Marcus finally looked back at her table, she raised her empty champagne glass with deliberate slowness. "Well, since you're still on duty, I believe I need a refill." The words were a test, a reassertion of hierarchy. Around her, the air grew tense again. Marcus could feel the collective holding of breath as everyone waited to see what he would do. He walked to her table slowly, picked up the champagne bottle from its silver ice bucket, and carefully refilled her glass. His hand was steady. When he was done, he set the bottle down and looked directly into her eyes. "I'm not a toy, ma'am. I'm not entertainment for your amusement. I'm a person with a gift, doing honest work to survive. And no amount of money or power changes that." The words were quiet, delivered without anger or aggression. But they carried a weight that made Victoria lean back slightly in her chair. For perhaps the first time in years, someone had spoken to her with absolute honesty, without fear of consequences, without calculation of what they might gain or lose. Her companions had gone very still. This kind of confrontation didn't happen in their world, where everyone traded in careful diplomacy and strategic positioning. Diane, the gallery owner, was watching Victoria with an expression that might have been disappointment. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, very quietly, she spoke. "You can go." It wasn't an acceptance or an apology. But it also wasn't the dismissal Marcus had expected. He nodded once, picked up his tray, and walked away with his head high, feeling the eyes following him but no longer caring what they saw. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Other servers approached him during breaks, some offering congratulations, others clearly worried about what his confrontation with Victoria Hale might mean for all of them. Management called him into the office, where he endured a stern lecture about maintaining professional boundaries with guests, though the manager's heart clearly wasn't in it. There had been too many witnesses, too many influential people who had seen what really happened. When Marcus finally left the hotel at 3 in the morning, the autumn air hit his face like a baptism. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the business card still in his pocket, feeling the weight of possibility pressing against his chest. Tomorrow he would call the number. Tomorrow he would take a leap into unknown territory. Tomorrow everything might change. But tonight, he simply walked home through streets that belonged to neither the rich nor the poor, but to the strange hours between midnight and dawn. He thought about his mother, who would be asleep in their small apartment, exhausted from her shift at the hospital. He thought about the years of compromise, the swallowed pride, the daily erasure of self that survival required. And he thought about Victoria Hale's face in that moment when his voice had first filled the ballroom, the shock of being confronted with something her money couldn't buy or control or diminish. That, more than anything, felt like victory. The next morning, Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of his bedroom. For a moment, he lay still, wondering if the previous night had been a dream. Then he saw his server's uniform hanging on the back of the door, smelled the faint residue of expensive perfume that had clung to it from the ballroom. Real, then. It had all been real. His mother was already up, moving around in the kitchen with the careful quietness of someone trying not to wake others. Marcus found her sitting at their small table, her nurse's scrubs freshly pressed, her graying hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Morning, baby," she said, looking up with tired eyes that still managed warmth. "You got in late. Big event at the hotel." Marcus poured himself coffee, debating how much to tell her. Something happened. She studied his face with the intuition of someone who had raised him alone, who knew every expression and what it meant. Good something or bad something? Marcus pulled out Julian Crawford's business card, setting it on the table between them. His mother picked it up, her eyes widening as she recognized the name. "Marcus. A music producer. He heard me sing last night. Asked me to come see him." His mother's hand went to her mouth, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. But she'd cried enough tears over the years, over opportunities lost and dreams deferred. Instead, she reached across the table and gripped his hand hard. "Then you go see him. Today. Right now if you can." "Mama, what if it's nothing? What if he was just being nice?" "Then it's nothing, and you still have your job and your life." "But Marcus, baby, what if it's something?" She squeezed his hand tighter. "What if this is the door that finally opens?" Marcus looked at his mother, at the lines around her eyes that spoke of decades of struggle, at the strength that had never wavered even when everything else did. She had sacrificed so much for him. The least he could do was be brave enough to try. At 9:45, Marcus stood in the lobby of the Whitmore Grand, wearing his best clothes, which weren't much. Pressed khakis and a button-down shirt that was a bit worn at the collar. He felt conspicuously out of place among the wealthy guests moving through the marble foyer, but he forced himself to walk confidently toward the lounge. Julian Crawford was already there, sitting at a corner table with a newspaper and coffee. He looked up as Marcus approached, and his face broke into a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd come." "Please, sit." Marcus sat, feeling the surreal quality of the moment wash over him. Less than 12 hours ago, he'd been serving drinks to people like this. Now he was sitting as an equal, or at least being treated as one. "I want you to know," Julian began, folding his newspaper, "that what I heard last night wasn't just technically impressive. It had soul. It had truth. And those are things you can't teach." He leaned forward. "Tell me about your training." Marcus found himself talking, the words spilling out more easily than he'd expected. He told Julian about growing up in the Bronx, about singing in church, about the dreams he'd had and the doors that had closed. He talked about the audition for Juilliard, about the scholarship that went to someone else, about learning to accept that some paths simply weren't meant for people without resources. Julian listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Marcus finished, the producer was quiet for a moment before speaking. "The industry isn't fair. You know that already. It favors people with connections, with money, with the right look or background. You'll face obstacles that white singers never have to consider. There will be people who doubt you because of where you come from, how you look, assumptions they'll make before you open your mouth." He paused. "But talent like yours doesn't come along often. And I've built a career on finding diamonds in places other people never think to look." "What are you offering?" Marcus asked, hardly daring to believe this was happening. "A real audition. At my studio, with a full production team. No promises beyond that, but a genuine chance. If you're as good in a professional setting as you were last night, we'll talk about a recording contract." Julian pulled out another card, this one with an address. "Next Monday, 2 in the afternoon. Can you make it?" Marcus thought about his schedule at the hotel, about the shifts he'd have to skip, about the risk of asking for time off after last night's incident. Then he thought about his mother's words, about doors finally opening. "I'll be there." They shook hands, and Marcus left the hotel feeling like he was walking on air. The city looked different in morning light, full of possibility rather than obstacle. He called his mother from a payphone, hearing her whoop of joy even through the crackling line. But not everything was celebration. News of the incident at the gala had spread, as things did in New York's interconnected social circles. By afternoon, Marcus's phone was ringing with calls from people he barely knew, some offering congratulations, others warning him about the dangers of embarrassing someone like Victoria Hale. "She's vindictive," one acquaintance told him. "I've seen her destroy people's careers for less." Marcus tried not to think about it, but the warnings lodged in his mind like splinters. Victoria Hale hadn't gotten where she was by accepting humiliation gracefully. He'd challenged her authority in front of her peers, had refused to stay in the role she'd assigned him. There would be consequences. They came sooner than he expected. On Friday, Marcus arrived at work to find his manager waiting with an uncomfortable expression. "We need to talk." In the office, the manager explained that several high-profile guests had expressed concerns about Marcus's professionalism. No specific complaints, just vague unease about his behavior at the gala. The hotel valued its relationship with these guests. Perhaps it would be better if Marcus took some time off. Let things cool down. Marcus understood what was really happening. Victoria's power extended far beyond her personal presence. She had reached out through her network, applied pressure in ways that left no fingerprints. The hotel couldn't afford to alienate someone of her stature. Not for a server who could be easily replaced. "Am I fired?" Marcus asked directly. The manager looked pained. "Let's call it a temporary leave. Unpaid, unfortunately. We'll reassess in a few weeks." Walking out of the hotel for what might be the last time, Marcus felt anger and fear warring in his chest. The audition with Julian was days away, but he still needed to pay rent, still needed to help his mother with bills. One door opening didn't mean others couldn't slam shut. He spent the weekend practicing, using the empty church where he'd sung as a child. The pastor, who remembered him from years ago, gave him a key and told him to use the space whenever he needed. Marcus sang until his voice was raw, working through standards and contemporary pieces, trying to prepare for every possibility. On Monday morning, he woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep. He dressed carefully, pressed his shirt twice to get the collar exactly right. His mother made him breakfast even though he couldn't eat, then stood at the door to see him off like it was his first day of school. "Remember who you are," she told him, straightening his collar one last time. "Not what anyone tried to make you feel like. Remember the gift God gave you." The studio was in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, all exposed brick and high ceilings. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time in his car, breathing exercises and quiet prayers. When he finally walked in, Julian was there with a team, a sound engineer, a pianist, and 2 other people whose roles Marcus didn't quite catch. "Ready?" Julian asked. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice yet. They started with warm-ups, technical exercises that helped the engineer set levels and helped Marcus settle into the space. The acoustics were different from the church, different from the ballroom, requiring adjustment. But gradually, he found his comfort zone, let his voice open up fully. "Okay," Julian said after about 20 minutes. "Let's hear what you can really do. Your choice of song." Marcus thought for a moment, then requested Bridge Over Troubled Water. It was ambitious, a song that demanded both technical skill and emotional depth. But it felt right, felt like the truth of his life distilled into melody. The pianist played the opening notes. Marcus closed his eyes, found his center, and began. This time, he wasn't singing under duress or defiance. This time, he was singing because it was what he was meant to do, because in this moment, nothing else existed but the music and the truth it carried. His voice soared and dipped, caressed and commanded, telling a story of struggle and hope that needed no translation. When he finished, the room was silent. Marcus opened his eyes to find Julian leaning back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. The engineer was nodding slowly, and the pianist looked impressed. "Well," Julian said finally, "I think we have some things to discuss." What followed was a blur of technical talk, contract negotiations, plans, and possibilities that Marcus could barely process. The core message was clear: they wanted to work with him. A real contract. Recording time. Professional production. It wouldn't happen overnight, and there were no guarantees of stardom. But it was legitimate. It was real. Marcus left the studio in a daze, contract paperwork clutched in his hand. He called his mother from the street, and they cried together over the phone, her voice thick with joy and relief and pride. But even in his happiness, Marcus couldn't forget Victoria Hale, couldn't forget the look on her face when he'd refused to diminish himself for her entertainment. Part of him wondered if she'd tried to stop this too, if Julian had received calls warning him away. If so, the producer hadn't mentioned it. The months that followed were intense. Recording sessions that stretched into early morning, vocal coaching, interviews with marketing people who wanted to craft his image. Marcus insisted on maintaining some control over his story, refusing to be packaged as either a tragedy or a triumph. He was just a singer, he told them. Someone who'd been given a chance and taken it. His first single dropped in late winter, a soulful ballad that showcased his range and emotional depth. It didn't set the charts on fire immediately, but it gained steady traction, picked up by radio stations and streaming playlists. People responded to the authenticity in his voice, to the sense that he'd lived every word he sang. By spring, Marcus was being invited to perform at increasingly prominent venues. Not stadiums yet, but respected clubs, prestigious showcases, the kind of places where industry professionals came to scout new talent. He was building a reputation, earning respect note by note. The invitation to perform at the Whitmore Grand's annual spring gala came as a surprise. Julian brought it to him during a recording session, watching his face carefully. "You don't have to accept," the producer said. "I know that place has complicated history for you. But it's a prestigious event, and the exposure could be valuable. Your choice entirely." Marcus looked at the elegant invitation, remembering the last time he'd been in that ballroom. "Will she be there? Victoria Hale?" Julian shrugged. "She's usually invited to these things. But that shouldn't matter. You'd be there as a performer, an artist. Entirely different context." Marcus thought about it for a long moment. Part of him wanted to refuse, to avoid the possibility of confrontation. But another part, the part that had found his voice in the first place, wanted to return to that space on his own terms. "I'll do it." The night of the gala, Marcus arrived early for sound check. The ballroom looked exactly as he remembered, but everything felt different. This time, he entered through the main doors instead of the service entrance. This time, he had a dressing room instead of a uniform. This time, his name was on the promotional materials in elegant script. Featuring Marcus Green. He stood on the empty stage, looking out at the chairs being arranged, at the same chandelier that had witnessed his humiliation and transformation. A year ago, he'd been invisible here. Tonight, he was the main event. The guests began arriving around 7. Marcus watched from backstage as the room filled with the same kind of people who'd been there before. Wealthy, influential, comfortable in their power. He searched the crowd and found her. Victoria Hale, looking as regal and untouchable as ever, surrounded by her usual entourage. Their eyes met across the room for just a moment. Marcus couldn't read her expression. She looked away first. When it was time to perform, Marcus walked onto the stage to warm applause. The lights were hot on his face, but he could still see into the audience, could see Victoria sitting at a center table just as she had before. The symmetry was almost perfect. Julian had encouraged him to open with something upbeat, but Marcus had other plans. He nodded to his accompanist, and began with Summertime, the same song he'd sung that first night. But this time, it was his choice. This time, he was in control. His voice filled the room with the same power and beauty it had before, but now there was no shock value, no element of surprise. This was expected, anticipated, and somehow that made it more profound. He wasn't a curiosity or a hidden talent revealed. He was simply an artist doing what artists do, speaking truth through song. As he sang, Marcus watched Victoria's face. She sat very still, her champagne glass untouched on the table before her. Her companions had stopped trying to engage her in conversation. She was listening, really listening, in a way she probably hadn't that first night. Marcus moved through his set with growing confidence, mixing standards with original songs from his upcoming album. The audience was rapt, offering applause after each number, but he kept coming back to Victoria in his peripheral vision. She never left, never looked away, sat through the entire performance with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. For his final song, Marcus chose something he'd written himself, a piece about dignity and survival, about refusing to be diminished by those who wielded power without wisdom. It was personal, vulnerable, and undeniably pointed. When he sang the line, "I am not your entertainment, I am not your toy," he looked directly at Victoria. The room understood. The silence that followed was different from the one that first night, less about shock and more about recognition. These people knew the story, had heard about what happened. Some of them had been there. Now they were watching the conclusion of something that had begun in humiliation and was ending in triumph. Marcus took his bow to thunderous applause, then left the stage. He expected to head straight to the dressing room, but Julian caught him in the wings. "Someone wants to speak with you." Marcus followed his gaze and saw Victoria Hale standing near the stage door, apart from her group, waiting. His first instinct was to refuse, to leave through another exit. But something in her posture made him pause. She looked smaller somehow, less certain. He walked over slowly. Up close, he could see new lines around her eyes, a tension in her jaw that spoke of internal struggle. "That was remarkable," she said quietly. Both times. Marcus waited, saying nothing. Victoria seemed to struggle with her next words. "I owe you an apology. What I did that night was cruel and demeaning. I treated you like an object, like entertainment for my amusement, and I was wrong." She paused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just acknowledging the truth." Marcus studied her face, searching for insincerity or manipulation. But she seemed genuine, if uncomfortable. This woman who commanded rooms and ran empires looked genuinely uncertain standing before him. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you do it?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "Because I could. Because no one had told me no in so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be challenged. Because I'd started to believe that wealth and power meant I could treat people however I wanted." She met his eyes. "You reminded me I was wrong. Painfully, publicly wrong. And the attempts to have me fired?" She didn't flinch from the accusation. "I made some calls, yes. I was angry, embarrassed. I wanted to reassert control." A pause. "They were wrong calls. I can't undo them, but I can acknowledge they were wrong." Marcus considered her words. An apology didn't erase what had happened. Didn't give him back the weeks of lost income or the anxiety of uncertainty. But it was more than he'd expected, more than someone like Victoria Hale typically offered. "I accept your apology," he said finally. "Not because it fixes anything, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. You taught me something that night too, even if you didn't mean to." "What's that?" "That talent is power too. Different from money or influence, but just as real. And that dignity comes from inside, not from what others think or say." Victoria nodded slowly. "You're going to go far, Marcus Green. You have something rare." She extended her hand. "I hope you use it well." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the strangeness of the gesture. A year ago, she'd commanded him to sing for her amusement. Now they stood as something approaching equals, two people who had taught each other lessons neither had wanted to learn. He left the hotel that night with his mother, who'd attended as his guest, sitting in the audience with tears of pride streaming down her face. They rode the subway home together, too tired and happy to speak much, just sitting in comfortable silence as the train rattled through tunnels. The next day, Marcus woke to find his phone filled with messages. The performance had been filmed and shared, going viral in the way that powerful moments sometimes do. Thousands of people were talking about the waiter who became a singer, about the confrontation between wealth and talent, about the power of the human voice to transcend circumstance. Julian called him around noon. "We need to talk about increasing your tour schedule. And there's interest from some major venues. This is happening faster than we expected." Marcus listened to the plans and possibilities, feeling the strange vertigo of rapid change. His life was transforming in ways he'd barely dared imagine, doors opening faster than he could walk through them. But even as opportunities multiplied, Marcus tried to stay grounded. He continued living in the Bronx, taking the subway to recording sessions, helping his mother with bills. He visited the church where he'd practiced, working with young singers who reminded him of his younger self. He remembered what it felt like to be dismissed and diminished, and he tried to use his growing platform to amplify other voices that were being ignored. His album released in summer to critical acclaim and strong sales. He appeared on late-night shows, gave interviews, performed at festivals. The kid who'd served champagne was now the man whose music moved audiences. The transformation was complete, but Marcus never forgot how it began. A year after the spring gala, Marcus returned to the Whitmore Grand one more time, this time for a private event celebrating his album's success. Julian had arranged it partly as a symbolic gesture, bringing the story full circle. Standing on that stage again, looking out at a room filled with people who respected him, Marcus felt the full weight of his journey. From invisibility to visibility, from servitude to artistry, from humiliation to triumph. But the real victory wasn't fame or success. It was the preservation of his dignity, the refusal to let anyone else define his worth. He thought of Victoria Hale, who'd sent flowers and a note of congratulation. He thought of all the people who'd underestimated him, who'd seen only a server and missed the artist underneath. He thought of his mother, sitting in the front row again, her face radiant with pride. And then Marcus did what he always did, what he was born to do. He opened his mouth and sang, filling the room with beauty and truth, reminding everyone present that the human spirit cannot be bought, sold, or silenced. It can only be heard, if we're brave enough to listen. The chandelier crystals caught his voice and scattered it like light, each note a small miracle, each phrase a testament to persistence and grace. This was his room now, not through ownership but through transformation. He'd claimed this space, not with money or power, but with the one thing no one could take from him. His voice, his truth, his undiminished soul. And in the silence that followed his final note, in that moment of collective breath-holding before the applause began, Marcus understood that this was just the beginning. There would be other rooms, other stages, other moments where he'd be challenged to prove his worth. But he knew now what he carried inside, knew its value, knew that no one could diminish it unless he let them. The applause crashed over him like a wave, and Marcus bowed deeply, gratefully, fully aware of how far he'd come and how far he still had to go. The room fell silent one last time as he straightened, not with shock or shame, but with respect. And that silence, that acknowledgement of his humanity and artistry, was worth more than all the wealth the room contained. He walked off stage to a standing ovation, to a future that was his to shape, to a life that was finally, fully his own. The kid who'd been forced to sing had become the man who chose to, and in that choice lay all the difference in the world.